As dawn broke on the 15th of January, 1887, when the sun finally mustered the courage to pierce the frozen North Dakota horizon, three different men stepped out of their homes and made their way toward their barns. The first was Thomas Whitmore, proprietor of the local general store and owner of the county's finest ranch, who pulled open the door to his red-painted wooden barn. Inside, his 18 horses lay frozen solid in their stalls, their wide-open eyes coated in frost, having perished upright like statues carved from ice. The second man, Jonathan Kress, a fellow who constantly bragged about his 20 years of breeding horses down in Kentucky, discovered his livestock huddled together in a corner, desperately seeking a warmth that never materialized. 16 magnificent beasts wiped out over the course of a single night. The third, Reverend Elias Stone, a preacher who always assured his flock that the Almighty would provide, dropped to his knees before the stiff carcasses of his 10 sturdy draft horses. Without those animals, his family would be unable to plow their fields, haul their goods, or simply endure until the spring thaw. Yet, merely half a mile away, on the most modest homestead in the entire territory, an elderly man with age-trembling hands strolled unhurriedly toward a snow-blanketed mound of earth. There was no traditional barn in sight, just a peculiar hillock featuring a wooden door set right into the slope. For months, the local townsfolk had labeled him a lunatic, whispered that he was a sorcerer, and branded him a menace. His name was Dmitri Volkov, the old Russian immigrant who supposedly buried his livestock alive, as if they were already corpses. However, the moment he unlatched that door and made his way down the hard-packed earthen ramp, a wave of warm vapor billowed out into the freezing air, resembling the breath of a mythical dragon. Down below the surface, his dozen horses were very much alive and perfectly calm, happily munching on dry hay with gleaming coats and sharp, attentive eyes. Up above ground, the thermometer had plummeted to a staggering -68 degrees Fahrenheit. But to fully grasp how a penniless, friendless, and widowed old man conquered the deadliest winter of the 19th century, we must rewind the clock 9 months to April of 1886, the exact moment Dmitri Volkov rolled into the town of New Salem with his entire worldly possessions packed into a wagon pulled by a pair of scrawny horses. He was 63 years old, bearing a spine that had been permanently bowed by decades of grueling labor across the vast wheat fields of Ukraine. His beloved wife, Katya, had succumbed to a severe fever during their arduous trek from New York. Years prior, back in the old Russian Empire, he had already lost his 3 sons, one to a terrible illness, and the other 2 while serving in the Tsar's military forces. Dmitri arrived utterly alone, possessing a vocabulary of only a few broken English words, $23 secretly stitched into the lining of his heavy coat, and a solemn vow he had sworn to his dying wife: to claim a piece of land, establish a homestead, and simply stay alive. The local land agent handed him 160 acres through the Homestead Act, a plot absolutely nobody else desired due to its vast distance from the river, characterized by harsh, rocky soil, where the northern winds blasted mercilessly straight down from Canada. Because he couldn't spell out his own name using the English alphabet, Dmitri officially signed the property deed with a simple X. He spent his initial days out there sleeping underneath his wooden wagon, surviving on stale bread and drinking fresh water hauled from the nearby creek. He managed to hollow out a tiny dugout into the side of a hill, barely spacious enough to allow him to sleep curled up under a single blanket. He planted a very small vegetable garden, and then he simply started watching. He carefully noted how the howling gales swept across the open prairie without a single obstacle to slow them down. He paid close attention to the way his neighbors' timber-framed houses groaned and rattled against every violent gust. He observed that the traditional barns, erected entirely above ground as was the local custom, bled heat incessantly, forcing the ranchers to burn absolute mountains of firewood just to get through the frigid months. Then, on a particular evening in May, while gazing up at the starry sky from his dirt dugout, an old memory washed over Dmitri. He vividly recalled the harsh winters of his childhood in Siberia, thinking back to when his grandfather, a tough man who had endured 75 brutal cold seasons, showed him a technique the Siberian peasants had practiced since time immemorial. They would carve out underground stables, harnessing the constant natural warmth of the earth itself, engineering subterranean shelters where livestock could thrive in temperatures that would easily slaughter any creature left, exposed to the Arctic blasts. His grandfather used to tell him, "The earth is the mother to every one of us, and just like any good mother, she keeps her children warm within her embrace." Bright and early the very next morning, Dmitri hiked all the way into town, intending to spend his final few dollars on essential tools. Standing inside Thomas Whitmore's general store, a heavy-set proprietor sporting a waxed mustache and a fancy silk vest, he used his fractured English to request a shovel, a pickaxe, some sturdy support timber, and a barrel of nails. Whitmore eyed him from head to toe, easily calculating the old man's severe poverty by looking at his heavily patched clothing and the holes worn straight through his boots, before asking him exactly what he was planning to build. Filled with pride for his upcoming project, Dmitri did his best to clarify. He was going to make a subterranean barn for his horses to survive the winter. Whitmore let out a booming laugh that echoed off every wall in the establishment. He immediately waved over 2 other patrons so they could hear the crazy old fool who wanted to bury his livestock alive. Jonathan Kress, the boastful Kentucky horse breeder, mocked him right to his face, declaring that horses require fresh air, abundant sunlight, and plenty of overhead clearance to toss their manes. To bury them underground would just be a slow death sentence, Kress insisted, claiming they would end up with fungus growing in their lungs and damp rot settling deep into their bones. Reverend Stone, who happened to be purchasing a supply of candles for his congregation, shook his head with sheer pity and promised he would pray for the confused immigrant's soul, deciding that the profound grief of losing his wife had clearly driven the poor man out of his wits. Dmitri didn't argue back, nor did he make any attempt to persuade them. He simply settled the bill for his hardware, a total of $12.50 that left his coin pouch practically entirely depleted, and began the long trek back to his homestead under the bright May sunshine. Rumors tend to spread like wildfire throughout tiny frontier towns in the Old West. By the time Sunday rolled around, the entire Methodist congregation had caught wind of the insane Russian fellow who was busy digging a massive grave for his own draft animals. The local women whispered that it had to be some sort of pagan ritual, or perhaps dark witchcraft imported all the way from the shadowy corners of Eastern Europe. The men just chalked it up to sheer stupidity, viewing him as just one more clueless newcomer destined to freeze to death during his first winter because he stubbornly refused to listen to the locals who truly understood the territory. But by this point, Dmitri was entirely deaf to the chatter of the outside world. He had learned a long time ago that human arrogance doesn't keep livestock warm, and that fancy talk does absolutely nothing to stop a freezing gale. He had a dozen horses relying on him for food, a terrifying winter approaching that he needed to defeat, and his grandfather's memory echoing softly in his head. Dig deep, build it strong, and put your faith in the dirt. If you're watching this right now and you believe that the timeless wisdom of our elders holds far more value than the pride of modern folks, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. We are actively rescuing the incredible tales that history tried to erase, the accounts of humble men and women who overcame impossible odds without seeking out any fanfare or public praise. Make sure you hit that red subscribe button, because the next part of this story is going to show you exactly how Mother Nature rewards those who show her respect, while brutally punishing those who choose to ignore her laws. The physical labor officially kicked off during the very first week of June, right when the frost finally left the ground, making the earth soft enough to shovel without shattering his tools. Dmitri specifically selected a south-facing slope, picking a spot that was just elevated enough to steer clear of the messy spring thaw floods, yet nestled low enough to remain shielded against those brutal northern winds. Armed only with his pickaxe and a sturdy shovel, he started hacking into the hillside, taking on a grueling task that was entirely unsuited for a 63-year-old man suffering from arthritic knees and relentless lower back agony. Over the course of that first day, he managed to dig down a mere 3 feet into a section roughly 10 feet wide. Even though his palms were heavily calloused from decades of agricultural toil, they quickly broke out in fresh blisters that eventually popped and bled, leaving streaks of red all over the wooden handle of his shovel. By the second day, he could barely even curl his fingers into a fist, and by the third, every single motion he made felt like a quiet, desperate prayer, just to keep going. Nevertheless, Dmitri had endured significantly worse tragedies in his lifetime, having literally buried his eldest boy with his own 2 hands after the 12-year-old succumbed to a horrific bout of cholera. He had carried the lifeless body of his wife for 2 whole days straight, just to locate a priest willing to lay her to rest with a proper Christian blessing. The agonizing stinging in his hands was merely physical pain, and it would eventually fade. But frozen horses would never spring back to life. For the initial 3 weeks, he carved his way straight into the belly of the hill, hollowing out a gently sloping tunnel that served as a 12-foot wide dirt ramp, perfectly angled so his livestock could walk down into the earth without losing their footing. The soil out in North Dakota is incredibly dense, packed full of heavy clay and stubborn rocks, meaning every single cubic foot he hauled out weighed well over 100 pounds. He would load all that excavated dirt into a makeshift wheelbarrow cobbled together from scrap lumber pulled off his old wagon, piling the earth outside to form a massive retaining wall that he planned to use later as an extra layer of insulation. The passageway dipped down at roughly a 20-degree angle, ultimately bottoming out at a depth of 8 solid feet beneath the surface of the prairie. Once he hit that mark, Dmitri shifted his efforts sideways, digging out a massive rectangular cavern, measuring 30 feet in length and 20 feet across. It was more than spacious enough to comfortably house a dozen large horses, leaving ample room for them to shift around, for feeding troughs, and for stockpiling a mountain of winter hay. But strangely enough, the digging wasn't the most treacherous part of the operation. The real nightmare was guaranteeing the earthen ceiling wouldn't suddenly cave in and bury him alive. Dmitri relied heavily on the old lessons his grandfather had taught him back in Siberia, where the architects of these subterranean shelters utilized the architectural principle of the natural vault. If you pack the dirt with enough force and shape it properly, the earth itself possesses the remarkable ability to support its own immense weight for decades, or perhaps even centuries. However, the raw soil needed a bit of structural support to get started. Utilizing the fresh lumber he had purchased, along with several heavy beams scavenged from a ruined barn sitting 5 miles away, which he lugged back on his own shoulders over 3 back-breaking trips, he rigged up a system of temporary wooden scaffolding. He planted thick, vertical posts every 6 feet straight down the center line of the underground chamber, resting massive horizontal beams across them that stretched from one end of the room to the other. On top of those main beams, he laid down crosswise planks, crafting a highly rustic yet perfectly functional wooden ceiling overhead. But here is where the absolute genius of the old Siberian method comes into play. That wooden framework wasn't actually the final roof at all. It was merely a temporary mold meant to hold the structure. Directly on top of those boards, Dmitri began shoveling mountains of soil, but not just loose dirt. He brutally pounded and compacted it with the flat back of his spade, blending it heavily with dry prairie grass and fibrous roots that functioned as natural rebar, creating a substance incredibly similar to adobe, but manufactured exclusively from what the plains provided. Layer by exhausting layer, he heaped on more earth, and by the end of 2 weeks, he had successfully packed down 3 solid feet of reinforced dirt over the wooden canopy. By the 4th week, that barrier had grown to 5 feet thick, representing an astronomical amount of weight, several literal tons of pressure pushing directly downward. Fortunately, the laws of physics were completely on his side, as the evenly distributed weight constantly compressed the soil, rendering it incredibly dense and exceptionally strong, essentially transforming it into a layer of artificial sedimentary rock. At that point, something practically magical occurred. The fiercely compacted earth began to hold itself up entirely on its own. The fresh grass roots sprouting on the top surface started shooting tiny filaments straight down, weaving a complex underground net that bound the soil together, much like the intricate threads of a woven tapestry. Once 2 long months had passed, Dmitri gingerly began knocking out the wooden support posts one by one, carefully testing the cavern's structural integrity. The earthen roof held perfectly firm, as the packed dirt had successfully cured into a flawless natural vault. The timeless principles of ancient architecture, the exact same engineering concepts that allowed the Romans to raise their grand aqueducts and empowered the Persians to build desert ice houses known as yakhchals, were now actively functioning through the calloused hands of an elderly Russian farmer out on the desolate Dakota plains. Getting a roof over their heads was only phase 1, because Dmitri understood perfectly well that the ultimate secret to staying warm wasn't merely trapping heated air inside, but actively utilizing the deep, constant thermal energy of the earth itself. Plunging 8 feet beneath the topsoil, the ground temperature stays remarkably consistent all year round, typically fluctuating somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the specific latitude. Above ground, the ambient air could easily crash to -60 during a blizzard or skyrocket to a sweltering 100 degrees in mid-July. But down there, wrapped completely in the Earth's embrace, the climate barely shifted at all. It was effectively the same as residing inside a natural cave, except this particular cavern had been meticulously engineered specifically for the comfort of domestic livestock. Dmitri went ahead and installed several feed troughs fashioned from hollowed-out tree trunks, lining them up neatly along the earthen walls. He also rigged up a modest ventilation chimney using a piece of salvaged metal piping that poked just 2 feet above the exterior mound, providing just enough clearance to vent the stale air without inadvertently sucking in any freezing drafts. As for the main entrance, that wide dirt ramp sloping downward like the open throat of a sleeping giant, he outfitted it with a double-door system, placing a heavy wooden gate on the outside and a thick canvas curtain on the inside to form an airlock that provided exceptional extra insulation. By the middle of August, following 3 brutal months of utterly solitary labor, his subterranean horse bunker was finally complete. Dmitri had shelled out precisely $11.75 on his raw materials, purchasing the wooden support beams, the iron nails, the scrap metal vent pipe, and a pair of heavy hinges for his front door. Everything else had been manifested purely through his own 2 hands, his aching back, and his unbreakable sheer determination. He decided to herd all 12 of his horses down into the structure on a quiet Sunday afternoon, specifically choosing a time when he knew the rest of the county would be stuck inside the church pews and unavailable to come heckle him. At first, the massive beasts were quite jittery due to the unfamiliar darkness, but they settled down incredibly fast once they caught the scent of fresh hay and felt the comfortably dry air. Dmitri sparked up a trio of oil lanterns that he had suspended from the ceiling beams, casting a very dim but perfectly adequate glow over the underground space. Taking a seat on a small stool he had carved from a tree stump, he quietly watched his animals get comfortable in their new home. For the very first time since he had buried his beloved wife, the old man experienced a profound feeling that closely resembled genuine peace. He had managed to construct something deeply permanent, successfully honoring the cherished memory of his grandfather. And now, his only remaining task was to patiently await the winter snows and trust in the earth. However, right up above on the surface world, Dmitri's local reputation had plummeted even further into the gutter. Thomas Whitmore, while driving his wagon past the Russian's property and spotting that bizarre dirt hill equipped with a front door, loudly announced back at his general store that the thing looked exactly like an old Native American burial mound, adding that the old man was undeniably insane and quite possibly a serious threat to the community. Meanwhile, Jonathan Kress, a man who had just dumped $500 into erecting a magnificent 2-story wooden barn featuring genuine glass windows and private individualized stalls for each of his prized equines, would frequently ride past Dmitri's land just to chuckle and remind his wife to thank the good Lord for providing her with a spouse who possessed actual common sense. Reverend Stone actually took to his Sunday pulpit, and without naming any names but making his target painfully obvious to everyone, delivered a sermon warning against the terrible vanity of men who trust entirely in their own bizarre methods, instead of following the proven, established ways of the good Christian community. Not a single neighbor bothered to stop by Dmitri's farm to ask him about the actual mechanics of his underground structure, and nobody displayed even an ounce of genuine curiosity. The blind arrogance of folks who are utterly convinced they already know everything always builds walls far taller than any simple language barrier ever could. And as for Dmitri, he wasn't looking for their approval anyway. Every single morning, he simply woke up well before dawn, unlatched the heavy door to his earthen bunker, and hiked down the ramp to feed his animals. Then, every evening, he would head back up to his tiny surface cabin, a highly modest structure he had quickly slapped together back in July using raw timber and thick mud. He survived on very meager rations, mostly eating dark rye bread he baked on a weekly basis, potatoes dug up from his tiny garden patch, and the occasional wild rabbit he managed to catch using homemade snare traps. He frantically hoarded every single penny he could scrape together with the sole intention of purchasing extra emergency hay before the severe cold finally hit. September soon rolled in, bringing along its trademark golden, slightly melancholy atmosphere. The leaves clinging to the sparse cluster of cottonwood trees down by the creek banks quickly began to shift their vibrant colors. Massive flocks of wild geese started flying directly south, traveling in formations so dense they literally blotted out the midday sun. The true old-timers in town, the rugged pioneers who had already survived 20 or 30 brutal winters out in the Dakotas, started eyeing the sky with deep mounting anxiety. There were troubling signs everywhere, like the local squirrels aggressively hoarding significantly more nuts than they usually did. The beavers down by the river were busily constructing dams that were notably taller and considerably thicker than previous years. Even the wild horse herds were noticeably migrating down into the highly protected, sheltered valleys several weeks earlier than their standard schedule. Mother Nature, operating within her silent, ancient wisdom, was absolutely screaming out harsh warnings that only a select few individuals actually knew how to decipher. Dmitri, who had practically mastered the art of reading those exact same natural indicators back on the frozen Russian steppes, immediately doubled his preparations. He went out and purchased 6 full tons of dried hay, vastly more feed than his dozen horses would require during a typical season, and stuffed it all deep inside his subterranean shelter, stacking the bales directly up to the dirt ceiling throughout the entire back half of the room. He bought heavy barrels overflowing with raw oats, meticulously patched up every single drafty crack in his surface cabin. And then he simply waited. The initial waves of harsh cold slammed into the territory in October, arriving far earlier than anyone had anticipated. One particular morning, folks woke up to find all the mud puddles coated in a layer of ice as thin and fragile as window glass. The very first snowfalls, incredibly light and almost tragically beautiful, blanketed the wide-open prairie under a pristine white coat that looked deceivingly harmless. Over at his property, Thomas Whitmore fired up the cast-iron stoves installed inside his massive barn, aggressively burning through premium oak firewood he had imported all the way from Minnesota at a staggering financial cost. Jonathan Kress busily strapped highly specialized custom-made blankets across the backs of his purebred equines, utilizing coverings woven from the finest sheep's wool available back in his home state of Kentucky. Meanwhile, Reverend Stone quickly organized a massive prayer chain, begging the Almighty to ensure the impending winter would show mercy to the impoverished families scattered across the county. Down on his modest homestead, Dmitri was busy inspecting his earthen bunker every single day. He noted with immense satisfaction that the interior temperature hovered steadily right around 48 degrees Fahrenheit, holding its ground even when the thermometer outside plummeted to a biting 20 degrees. He didn't require a single roaring fire nor did he need to mess around with any woolen horse blankets. His sturdy draft horses, radiating their own natural body heat and thoroughly shielded by tons of thick dirt, were exceptionally comfortable. Their heavy breathing didn't even condense into thick clouds of white vapor, simply because the ambient air around them wasn't nearly freezing enough to cause the reaction. They ate in absolute tranquility, slurping down fresh water from a large trough that Dmitri manually refilled twice a day using heavy metal buckets hauled straight from the nearby creek. It was incredibly grueling, backbreaking physical labor, without a doubt, but the system worked flawlessly. It operated with a sheer, beautiful simplicity that would have brought literal tears of pride to his grandfather's eyes. But then November finally rolled into town, and it brought along the very first undeniable indicators that this was absolutely not going to be your run-of-the-mill ordinary cold season. On the 5th day of November, the ambient temperature spectacularly crashed down to absolute 0 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of less than 3 hours. The brutal northern wind descended upon them like a completely invisible invading army, howling violently across the open plains with a terrifying fury that caused the glass window panes to rattle uncontrollably in their frames. Deep inside Thomas Whitmore's grand barn, his prize horses actually started violently shivering, completely regardless of the roaring fires continuously burning inside 2 separate cast-iron stoves. The wooden planking, no matter how thick and sturdy the lumber was, simply couldn't halt the biting wind. Every single tiny crack, every microscopic joint right between the wooden boards, actively allowed the deadly chill to seep inside, just like freezing water pouring through a heavy fishing net. Out of pure desperation, Whitmore burned through a staggering $3 worth of premium firewood in a single night, frantically feeding the metal stoves to keep the flames roaring. By the time the sun finally came up, 2 of his most senior horses were openly exhibiting the classic symptoms of equine pneumonia, continuously coughing and visibly trembling from the bitter cold. Over at Jonathan Cress's highly elegant stables, fully equipped with its fancy glass windows and private individualized stalls, the underlying issue was entirely different, yet equally disastrous. The wooden structure was undeniably gorgeous to look at, sure, but it had been entirely engineered with visual aesthetics in mind, rather than focusing on extreme, brutal survival. Those massive glass panes, which allowed such wonderful warm sunlight to flood the room during the spring months, had suddenly transformed into massive voids, hemorrhaging internal heat. Cress frantically nailed heavy wooden planks over the fragile glass in a desperate panic, but the catastrophic damage had already been done. His highly pampered horses, entirely accustomed to sheer luxury and constant comfort, simply hadn't developed the rugged physical stamina required to withstand that level of genuine, biting cold. They rapidly began dropping significant amounts of body weight, aggressively burning through their caloric reserves for the sole purpose of trying to maintain their core body temperatures. Meanwhile, Reverend Stone, armed with his immense faith but severely lacking in actual financial resources, just kept desperately praying and shoveling extra hay into the feed troughs, genuinely believing that overfeeding his livestock would somehow magically keep them warm. In a way, his method actually worked, but the financial toll it took was absolutely brutal to his wallet. He was aggressively burning through his hay reserves at triple the normal rate, and the calendar was only just displaying November. If this particular cold season dragged on into March, as it so often did in the Dakotas, he would entirely run out of winter feed by February, practically guaranteeing his animals would starve to death. Conversely, Dmitri was calmly observing how his underground shelter handled the plummeting temperatures with the detached curiosity of a seasoned scientist. While the outside air had completely crashed to absolute 0 deep inside his bunker, the glass thermometer he had pinned to the dirt wall was resting comfortably at 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior climate had merely dropped a measly 2 degrees. The raw earth, possessing an incomprehensible amount of physical mass, was functioning exactly like a gigantic thermal battery, very slowly radiating all the solar heat it had absorbed during the summer months and effectively fighting off the brutal winter assault. standing calmly in the warm, dimly lit environment of the bunker. His horses weren't exhibiting a single sign of physical stress. In fact, they were actually more relaxed than they had ever been, primarily because the partial darkness and the dead silence of the subterranean room essentially kept them in a nearly meditative trance. There was no screaming, howling wind down there, and no terrifying sounds of wooden boards violently groaning under the pressure. The only noise present was the incredibly gentle sound of 12 massive horses happily chewing their dry hay, perfectly safe within the peaceful belly of the earth. But the ultimate, terrifying test had not even arrived yet. Because the brutal winter of 1886 to 1887 wasn't destined to be remembered merely as a difficult cold season in the history books. It would permanently be etched into history as the catastrophic winter that effortlessly slaughtered millions. On the 12th of November, a cattle rancher going by the name of Marcus Holt paid a visit to Dmitri's homestead. He didn't drop by out of neighborly curiosity, but rather because his usual route into town took him right past the property, and he had noticed smoke billowing from the old Russian's modest cabin. Holt was a thoroughly pragmatic fellow, never one to indulge in idle town gossip or rush to hasty judgments. He had certainly caught wind of the rumors regarding the subterranean barn, and, truthfully, he harbored his own set of doubts. He knocked on Dmitri's front door with his massive, heavy hand, and when the elderly man finally opened up, Holt requested, speaking in that loud, exaggeratedly slow English people often use with foreigners, to take a look at the infamous dirt grave barn. Caught slightly off guard, but genuinely pleased to welcome a guest who hadn't come merely to mock him, Dmitri gave a firm nod and led the rancher straight toward the earthen mound. He pulled open the heavy exterior wooden gate, then peeled back the inner canvas curtain, and the pair began their descent down the sloping dirt ramp. Being entirely accustomed to standard drafty barns filled with biting cold, Marcus Holt experienced something rather peculiar about halfway down the tunnel. A distinct wave of relative warmth suddenly washed over his face. It wasn't a blazing, radiating heat like you'd get from a cast-iron stove. Rather, it was the profound absence of the freezing chill, which felt like an absolute blessing after spending hours battling the icy winds. Once they hit the bottom floor and Dmitri sparked up the oil lanterns, Holt scanned the room with wide, disbelieving eyes. The massive draft animals were completely at ease. Their coats had a healthy shine. There wasn't a speck of frost clinging to the dirt walls, and no thick vapor was condensing in the air. He pressed his bare palm directly against the earthen wall, and immediately realized it wasn't freezing at all. It was merely cool to the touch, feeling very much like the inside of a deep root cellar. The rancher stood completely speechless for a long, heavy minute. Eventually, he asked how many cords of wood Dmitri had to burn to maintain that level of warmth. Shaking his head, the old man replied, "None whatsoever." There was no fire down there, just the raw earth. Holt glanced up at the reinforced ceiling, actively searching for some hidden heating apparatus, but there was absolutely nothing. He then inquired about the total construction cost. Holding up his calloused fingers, Dmitri gave him the exact figure, $11.75. Holt had dropped a staggering $300 erecting his own timber barn, and his livestock were currently shivering in their stalls. A visible shift occurred across the rancher's rugged face. He didn't proclaim that Dmitri was an architectural genius, nor did he offer any apologies for his previous skepticism. He merely gave a slow, respectful nod, mumbled his thanks in a gravelly tone, and marched straight back outside to mount his horse. Yet Marcus Holt was cut from a different cloth than Thomas Whitmore. He wasn't a fellow whose pride bruised easily. Later that very evening, while sitting at the dinner table with his wife, he quietly confessed, "That elderly Russian fellow possesses knowledge we completely lack, and perhaps the town should have paid attention to him." Tragically, it was already far too late in the season to start digging. The prairie soil was rapidly freezing several feet deep. Whatever structures had already been raised would simply have to suffice, and whatever hadn't been built would ultimately doom the unprepared homesteaders. December marched in, dragging along relentless, punishing snowfalls. Every couple of days, a fresh blizzard would dump another 6, 8, or even 10 inches of powder right on top of the existing drifts. The county roads quickly became entirely impassable. Families found themselves completely marooned on their remote claims, venturing into the settlement only when it was a matter of absolute life or death. The local wildlife practically vanished, either hunkered down deep inside their dens or already killed off by the freezing temperatures. Then, on the 22nd of December, the first truly catastrophic blow landed. A massive front of Arctic air swept down from the Canadian border like a gigantic icy fist, and within 24 hours, the ambient temperature plummeted to negative 30 degrees. Not 30 degrees Fahrenheit above freezing, 30 degrees strictly below zero. When it gets that brutally cold, spitting into the wind actually creates a tiny cloud of crystallized ice before the moisture ever hits the dirt. Solid iron tools become as fragile and brittle as cheap glass. Every exhale instantly freezes solid against a man's eyelashes and beard. Stepping outside without heavy, specialized gear essentially guarantees severe frostbite in under 5 minutes. Over at his property, Thomas Whitmore desperately kept 4 separate wood stoves roaring inside his barn, burning around the clock. He squandered an absolute fortune on chopped timber. However, the wooden structure was simply too cavernous, absolutely riddled with drafty gaps where the precious heat constantly leaked out. The timber framing, regardless of how thick the lumber happened to be, stood no chance against that level of extreme chill. His livestock managed to survive the night, though 3 of them developed severe respiratory issues caused by inhaling a toxic mix of freezing air and thick wood smoke. With the nearest animal doctor located 20 miles out and completely cut off by the massive snowdrifts, Whitmore was forced to treat his sick horses using unproven folk remedies, praying desperately that they would somehow pull through. Driven to pure desperation, Jonathan Kress made a drastic call. He physically herded his 16 most prized, expensive horses directly into his own home, literally packing them right into his family's living room and dining area. His wife fiercely objected, screaming and breaking down in tears, but Kress fully understood that if those animals perished, he would be completely ruined. They represented his entire financial investment and his family's future on the frontier. Consequently, the massive beasts moved indoors, quickly filling the residence with the overpowering stench of fresh manure and urine, prompting his disgusted wife to pack her bags and bunk with her sister in town. Still, at the very least, his valuable stock wouldn't freeze to death. Lacking the financial means for any extravagant solutions, Reverend Stone merely heaped extra feed into the troughs, swaddled his draft horses in every single blanket he owned, and placed his absolute trust in divine providence. Unfortunately, as he quickly learned the hard way, heavenly providence doesn't exactly override the basic laws of thermodynamics. 3 of his oldest workhorses rapidly began to deteriorate. In stark contrast, Dmitri kept up his routine, visiting his earthen bunker twice daily. Every morning, he hiked down the ramp hauling heavy buckets of creek water, which he now had to forcefully chop out with a heavy axe, because the stream was locked under 6 solid inches of ice. Come nightfall, he would descend once again to inspect the animals and pitch fresh hay. Every single time he unlatched that heavy door and stepped inside, the drastic contrast was absolutely staggering. Up on the surface, the territory was a frozen hellscape, but down below there was nothing but tranquility. Naturally, the interior temperature had dipped slightly to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, but it held incredibly steady. It didn't experience those violent, chaotic swings between scorching heat and biting frost that plagued the stove-heated timber barns. It was merely a gentle, highly manageable chill that the heavy horses, equipped with their thick winter coats, could easily endure without an ounce of physical stress. They kept eating heartily, drinking plenty of water, and resting comfortably. And then January arrived. This was the specific month the seasoned pioneers across the territory had been dreading all along. because those ominous autumn indicators hadn't been lying. This was truly destined to be the winter of absolute reckoning. The very first week of January ushered in howling gales clocking in at 60 miles per hour, packing powder so incredibly fine that it managed to blast its way through every conceivable crack and crevice. Glass windows became entirely encased in solid white drifts from the outside. Heavy wooden doors literally had to be shoveled out every single morning just to be cracked open. And the extreme cold only intensified. -40, -50. The weather experts stationed back in the eastern cities who possessed actual scientific equipment were logging terrifying temperatures they hadn't witnessed in decades. Out on the remote, isolated homesteads of North Dakota, however, there were no fancy meteorologists to consult. There were only desperate families fiercely battling to stay alive, alongside livestock trapped in a miserable limbo between life and death. On the 11th day of January, an apocalyptic weather phenomenon slammed directly into the territory. The official history books would eventually record this brutal event as part of the Children's Blizzard, tragically named because so many young students froze to death while attempting to walk home from their rural schoolhouses. However, for the local ranchers, it would forever be remembered simply as the day the Grim Reaper strolled freely across the open plains. A catastrophic blend of extreme temperatures and ferocious gales generated a lethal wind chill factor resting at 68 degrees below zero. When it drops to that extreme level, exposed human flesh freezes solid in under 60 seconds. The lungs can suffer permanent, irreversible tissue damage simply from inhaling air that's viciously cold, and livestock, lacking proper shelter, simply drop dead on the spot. Inside Thomas Whitmore's grand barn, despite having 4 cast-iron stoves roaring at full blast, the battle had already been completely lost. It absolutely didn't matter how many cords of wood he tossed into the flames. The biting cold was simply overpowering. Sure, the heaters managed to maintain tiny pockets of warmth right next to the iron metal, but the remainder of the massive room was lethally freezing. The desperate horses tightly crowded the fires, pushing in so close that a few of them actually scorched their own hair. Yet, stepping away meant certain death. Throughout the agonizing night, stretching from the 11th into the 12th, while Whitmore and his boys took turns frantically feeding the flames every 2 hours, utterly exhausted and drowning in despair, the beasts standing furthest from the heat began to collapse. First one went down, and then another quickly followed. Come dawn, when enough grayish light finally filtered in to assess the damage, 18 magnificent horses lay either completely dead or in their final agonizing moments. A few had literally frozen solid right inside their individual stalls. Others had choked on so much thick smoke pouring off the wood stoves that their lungs simply gave out. Whitmore, a proud man who constantly boasted about his immense wealth and business capabilities, collapsed right onto the dirt floor of his barn and wept uncontrollably like a little boy. He wasn't crying solely over the staggering financial ruin, which was undeniably devastating, but out of sheer, overwhelming helplessness. He had done everything completely by the book, or so he genuinely believed. He had thrown massive amounts of cash at the problem and labored without a second of rest, yet all of his efforts hadn't been nearly enough. Meanwhile, Jonathan Kress, having crammed his livestock directly into his living room, successfully shielded them from the freezing gales, but inadvertently birthed a whole host of new disasters. One of the massive beasts, highly agitated by the tight quarters and bizarre surroundings, violently kicked over a glass lantern during the night of January 12th. The kerosene spilled everywhere, and the flames immediately raced across the floorboards. Kress barely managed to smother the blaze before his entire homestead burned to the ground, but not before 2 of his prized equines sustained horrific burns. Furthermore, amidst all the chaotic panic, with the front doors thrown wide open to clear out the blinding smoke, the Arctic chill rushed inside with terrifying force. By the time the sun rose on the 13th, 3 of his magnificent horses were dead. not necessarily killed by the raw temperature itself, but taken out by the disastrous complications brought on by the sheer chaos. Kress slumped down onto the steps of his half-charred front porch, staring blankly at the stiff carcasses he had just dragged out into the snow, deeply questioning how his life had spiraled to this exact point. Here he was, a seasoned expert who had proudly bred fine horses for 2 solid decades down in Kentucky, utterly destroyed by his very first genuine Dakota winter. As for Reverend Stone, he lost a heartbreaking 7 out of his 10 draft horses between the 11th and the 14th of the month. He simply lacked the necessary financial ammunition to wage war against Mother Nature when she arrived in her absolute cruelest form. He buried the massive animals out in the snow with icy tears freezing solid against his cheeks, desperately wondering what terrible sin he had committed to warrant such a vicious divine punishment. His religious faith, which was normally steadfast and unshakable, violently wavered under the crushing weight of the catastrophe. Then, on the 14th of January, something truly extraordinary took place. Marcus Holt, the rugged rancher who had inspected Dmitri's underground bunker back in November, painstakingly rode his horse all the way out to the old immigrant's remote claim. He had tragically lost half of his cattle herd during the ferocious blizzard, but his horses had successfully pulled through because he had actively followed, as best as he could above ground, the unspoken lessons he had learned from looking at Dmitri's setup. Insulate heavily, drastically shrink the living space, and aggressively seal off any deadly drafts. Holt had physically boarded up 3/4 of his barn, cramming his livestock into a tightly confined pen where their combined natural body heat could work to their advantage. It was far from a flawless system, but it had kept them breathing. He rode out specifically to thank the elderly man. However, upon arriving, he stumbled upon a highly unexpected sight. Parked directly outside Dmitri's tiny cabin were 4 heavy wagons, alongside several hitched horses. The muffled sound of voices drifted out from inside the shack. Marcus gave the wooden door a firm knock. When Dmitri pulled it open, Holt spotted none other than Thomas Whitmore, Jonathan Kress, and Reverend Stone standing right behind the old man. There they sat, the exact same 3 prominent townsfolk who had viciously mocked the crazy Russian, gathered around Dmitri's rough-hewn wooden table, quietly sipping hot tea brewed from wild prairie herbs. All conversation abruptly died the moment Marcus stepped inside. The air in the tiny room was incredibly thick with tension and a deeply palpable sense of shame. Thomas Whitmore was the very first to break the heavy silence. His tone, typically so brimming with arrogant authority and booming confidence, sounded entirely shattered. He confessed, "I lost 18 good horses. We burned through every last dime buying firewood. We tried every single trick we knew. And it still didn't make a lick of difference." Jonathan Kress, sporting black soot smeared across his cheeks and smelling strongly of charred wood, nodded in grim agreement. "I lost 3 of my best, and I only managed to save the rest because I jammed them directly into my parlor and nearly burned my entire homestead to the ground." Reverend Stone, clutching his leather-bound Bible against his chest, like a man holding onto a life-preserver in a stormy sea, whispered hoarsely, "I buried 7, and the 3 I have left are incredibly weak. They'll never survive until the spring thaw." A long, agonizing stretch of silence followed. Eventually, Whitmore raised his bloodshot eyes toward Dmitri and asked the only question that truly mattered anymore. "How many did you lose out here?" Standing quietly next to his small cast-iron stove, his weathered face carved with wrinkles as deep as the local canyons, Dmitri responded in his slow, highly deliberate broken English, "Absolutely none. All 12 of my horses are still breathing. They are perfectly fine. They eat their hay, drink their water, and sleep peacefully. The dirt keeps them warm." Utter disbelief instantly washed over the faces of his 3 desperate guests. Whitmore essentially demanded to see the miracle with his own 2 eyes. So, maintaining the tranquil composure of a man who possesses absolutely nothing left to prove but deeply respects the undeniable power of hard evidence, Dmitri threw on his heavy winter coat and led the four men straight out toward the snow-covered mound. Out in the brutal elements, the fierce gales were still screaming. The small glass thermometer Dmitri had nailed to a wooden post right outside his front door was reading a terrifying negative 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Hiking those mere 100 yards out to the dirt bunker was pure, unadulterated torture, even while completely bundled in thick wool coats and heavy scarves wrapped tightly over their noses. The icy wind sliced straight through their clothing like sharpened butcher knives, and every breath of freezing air practically scorched their lungs. By the time the group finally reached the wooden gate buried into the hillside, every single man was shivering violently. Dmitri unlatched the heavy outer door, peeled back the thick canvas curtain, and escorted them straight down the shadowy dirt ramp. The ceiling lanterns were currently snuffed out to conserve his limited kerosene, but the old Russian had brought along a hand lantern. As they made their way deeper underground, the screaming wind magically vanished. That relentless, terrifying howling that had served as the dreadful soundtrack to their miserable lives for weeks on end simply faded into absolute nothingness. And then they experienced the exact same sensation Marcus Holt had encountered several weeks prior. That comforting wave of relative warmth. It certainly wasn't tropical, and it wouldn't even be considered comfortable for a man standing there in his shirt sleeves. But when stacked against the frozen nightmare raging up on the surface, it felt exactly like paradise. Dmitri sparked up the overhead oil lamps. The soft, yellowish glow illuminated the massive subterranean vault, revealing its heavily packed earthen ceiling, incredibly stable dirt walls, and massive stockpiles of untouched hay. And of course, the dozen massive horses. The draft animals casually lifted their heavy heads, gazing at the sudden visitors with mild, relaxed curiosity. Their eyes were bright and incredibly sharp, and their thick winter coats gleamed handsomely under the dancing lantern light. Not a single beast was shivering. None of them were hacking or coughing. They didn't display a shred of the agonizing suffering that had utterly wiped out the livestock trapped up above ground. Thomas Whitmore reached out his trembling hand and pressed it flat against the dirt wall. It was undoubtedly cool to the touch, but it was absolutely not frozen. Digging into his coat, Jonathan Kress produced his personal pocket thermometer, a fancy little gadget he typically carried around to monitor the climate inside his expensive breeding stalls. He hung it on a wooden peg protruding from the wall and waited 3 silent minutes. It read exactly 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Up on the surface, it was 53 below zero. Down inside the bunker, it was 41 degrees above the freezing mark. That was a staggering temperature swing of 94 degrees. No roaring fires, no cast-iron stoves, no chopped timber. It was nothing but raw earth, aggressively packed and shaped by the bare hands of an elderly immigrant who had simply bothered to remember his grandfather's ancient lessons. Reverend Stone slowly pulled off his heavy winter hat, dropped straight to his knees right there on the dirt floor of a subterranean barn, and began to pray. He wasn't begging the Lord for a miracle this time. It was a prayer filled with profound gratitude and deep humility. Because in that exact moment, he fully realized just how spectacularly arrogant and wrong he had been. He had spent his Sundays preaching loudly about the righteous path of the Lord versus the flawed ways of men, completely failing to recognize that sometimes the Almighty chooses to deliver his greatest lessons through the poorest folks, the oldest souls, and the exhausted foreigners carrying ancient wisdom from distant, forgotten lands. With icy tears actively freezing onto his soot-stained cheeks, Jonathan Kress desperately asked if he could haul his surviving horses down into the shelter. Dmitri nodded without a second of hesitation. "There is plenty of room," he assured the breeder. "However, we will all have to work as a team to transport them out here safely. The freezing wind is far too deadly for one man." Thomas Whitmore, a proud fellow who had essentially constructed his entire personal identity around being the wealthiest, most successful, and most knowledgeable man in the county, was forced to swallow the most bitter pill of pride he had ever faced in his life. Speaking in a barely audible whisper, he asked, "Would you be willing to teach me how to dig one of these before next winter arrives?" Dmitri stood there looking at the three prominent figures who had previously mocked him, laughed right in his face, and labeled him a lunatic and a practitioner of dark magic. He easily could have turned them all away to freeze. He could have taken sweet revenge, cutting them down with sharp, vindictive words. But Dmitri Volkov was a man who had personally shoveled dirt over the graves of his three sons and his beloved wife. He had survived brutal famines and bloody wars. He had learned the hard way that a man's life is far too fleeting to harbor toxic pride, and vastly too precious to squander on petty, childish revenge. So he simply gave a slow, affirming nod and spoke in his broken yet perfectly clear English. "Yes, I will show you how. But for now, go fetch your surviving animals. There is absolutely no time left for foolish pride while the Grim Reaper is pacing around outside." Over the course of the following 48 hours, executing an incredibly dangerous and physically exhausting rescue operation, the men successfully hauled the surviving equines belonging to Cress and Stone, alongside the final two barely breathing beasts from Whitmore's herd, straight into the dirt bunker. Every single trip back and forth across the prairie was a genuinely lethal gamble. They had to heavily swaddle the massive animals in thick blankets, tie burlap sacks over their heads to shield their sensitive eyes and nostrils from the razor-sharp gales, and blindly lead them through the frozen wasteland. Two of the exhausted horses collapsed mid-journey and literally had to be dragged the rest of the way by brute force. Nevertheless, when the dust finally settled, 22 additional horses were safely tucked away beneath the frozen topsoil, jammed tightly together inside a space Dmitri had originally intended for just a dozen, yet undeniably alive. The dirt cavern rapidly transformed into a literal subterranean ark of survival. The men pulled grueling shifts around the clock to ensure the massive beasts stayed fed and hydrated. Dmitri, completely disregarding his advanced age, outworked every single one of them, teaching the younger men how to ration out the hay with maximum efficiency, how to safely chop through the frozen creek without falling in, and exactly how to manage the metal vent pipe to prevent lethal gas buildups without accidentally bleeding out their precious warmth. And a rather miraculous shift occurred down inside that earthen room. The massive social barriers separating the men completely dissolved into nothing. Whitmore, the arrogant, wealthy tycoon, found himself shoveling manure shoulder to shoulder with the impoverished, ragged immigrant. Cress, the boastful Kentucky horse expert, openly confessed that he knew absolutely nothing about keeping livestock breathing in genuine Arctic conditions. Stone, the loud prairie preacher, learned firsthand that genuine humility serves as a far more powerful prayer than any booming Sunday sermon. And Dmitri, the isolated, lonely old man, finally found himself a true community. For 5 excruciatingly long days, the catastrophic cold maintained its deadly grip over the Dakota Territory. The ambient temperatures never managed to climb past -30 degrees. The heavy snows kept on dumping. The violent winds offered zero mercy. However, deeply buried beneath the soil, inside a rough shelter carved out by blistered hands and guided by ancient, inherited wisdom, 34 massive horses successfully survived. They chewed their feed, drank their water, and rested in a profound state of peace that the terrified humans trapped on the surface could barely even fathom. Then, finally, on the 20th of January, the brutal weather broke. A front of significantly warmer air, relatively speaking of course, pushed in from the western plains. The mercury slowly crept up to -10, then bumped up to absolute 0, and eventually, by some absolute miracle, hit 10 degrees above the freezing mark. The screaming gales finally died down. The bright sun cracked through the clouds for the very first time in over a week, casting its golden rays across a landscape that had been violently transformed into a blindingly white ocean of snow, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The familiar prairie was utterly unrecognizable, buried under massive snowdrifts, towering 15 feet high wherever the gales had piled them up. But the nightmare was officially over. The deadliest wave had finally passed. The ragged men crawled out of the earthen bunker, looking exactly like exhausted coal miners emerging from a collapsed shaft. They frantically blinked against the painfully bright sunlight after spending so many long hours trapped in the dim gloom. They scanned the horizon and took in the sheer, unadulterated devastation. The timber barns dotting the distance were heavily battered. A handful of wooden roofs had completely caved in beneath the astronomical weight of the packed powder. Miles of property fences were completely swallowed by the drifts, and radiating out in every single direction, there were horrific tales of profound loss. The Johansson family, settled roughly 3 miles to the east, had lost every single head of livestock they owned. The Murphy brothers, located up north, had completely abandoned their homestead, fleeing on foot toward town during the absolute worst of the blizzard, and leaving their entire livelihood behind to freeze. Early estimates suggested that roughly 50% of the entire county's horse population had been wiped out. A staggering 90% of the cattle left out to graze on the open plains had frozen solid. It was an agricultural disaster of truly biblical proportions, but out there on the tiny barren claim belonging to the crazy old Russian immigrant, every last horse was still breathing. Over the course of the following weeks, as the cold season dragged on, but with considerably less lethal fury, word regarding Dmitri's miraculous earthen bunker spread like absolute wildfire. Desperate homesteaders from entirely different counties rode out for miles on horseback, purely to witness the structure firsthand. Dmitri patiently escorted every single one of them down the ramp, utilizing his broken but highly effective English to explain the core architectural principles. Dig deep enough to harness the planet's geothermal heat, violently pack the dirt to establish a solid roof, vent the stale air without sucking in deadly drafts, and always utilize the front entrance as a heavily insulated airlock. A few folks frantically jotted down notes in little leather books. Others merely stood there staring in absolute awe. By the time the spring thaw finally hit in April and the vast prairie slowly began to turn green again, 7 separate local families had already broken ground on their own subterranean bunkers. Thomas Whitmore, heavily leaning on his vast financial wealth, but now armed with a newfound sense of profound humility, officially hired Dmitri as his lead architectural consultant and proceeded to excavate the single largest underground barn in the entire territory, easily capable of comfortably housing 40 massive draft animals. He proudly paid Dmitri a handsome $50 for the custom blueprints, which was more hard cash than the elderly man had held in his hands in several years. Jonathan Kress took a brief train ride back down to Kentucky, specifically to liquidate all his remaining assets down south, returning with a fierce determination to permanently settle in North Dakota, only this time doing things the right way. He dug out his own earthen shelter, a bit smaller but incredibly practical, and nobody ever heard him arrogantly boast about his fancy breeding expertise ever again. Reverend Stone smoothly wove Dmitri's incredible tale right into his Sunday sermons, utilizing the event as a powerful, living parable regarding genuine humility and how the greatest wisdom often arrives from the most highly unexpected sources. The entire frontier community had absorbed a brutal lesson that only Mother Nature, operating at her absolute cruelest, was capable of teaching. True, life-saving knowledge isn't purchased with heavy bags of gold, nor does it come from years of experience gained in entirely different climates, nor does it stem from blind, unthinking faith. It comes directly from careful observation, profound humility, and a genuine willingness to shut your mouth and learn from the folks who managed to survive before you arrived. Dmitri Volkov lived for another 17 peaceful years out on the plains. He quietly passed away in his sleep during the harsh winter of 1903, dying at the ripe old age of 80, right inside the tiny wooden cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. His neighbors found him the following morning, resting comfortably in his bed, bearing an expression of absolute peace across his deeply wrinkled face. He was laid to rest in the local town cemetery, marked by a highly modest headstone displaying only his name and the dates he walked the earth, and nothing more. His remarkable legacy, however, heavily outlived him. By the year 1910, more than 40 functional subterranean livestock bunkers were scattered across the county, every single one of them heavily based directly on his original blueprints. The groundbreaking Siberian technique rapidly spread out to neighboring territories, constantly being tweaked and improved upon, yet always firmly retaining the old Russians' core engineering principles. And while those earthen caverns were eventually rendered obsolete by modern, massive barns equipped with industrial-grade insulation and highly expensive electric heating systems, there are actually still a handful of those original subterranean shelters fully functioning today, well over a century later, scattered across the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming. They stand as silent, enduring testaments to the quiet wisdom of an elderly immigrant dirt farmer who simply bothered to remember exactly what his grandfather taught him under the frozen stars of Siberia. Incredible tales like the saga of Dmitri Volkov serve to violently remind us of timeless, eternal truths that our highly modern society so frequently tosses completely out the window. They remind us that genuine humility is absolutely not a form of weakness. It is actually the profound inner strength required to openly admit exactly what we do not know. They remind us that profound wisdom doesn't necessarily arrive printed on fancy university diplomas or stuffed inside heavy bags of cash, but rather stems directly from the careful, quiet observation of the natural world and a deep, abiding respect for the older generations who managed to stay alive long before we ever showed up. They remind us that foolish pride, that deeply flawed human emotion that convinces us to openly mock anyone who operates a little differently, can very easily cost us our entire livelihoods, while simply keeping an open mind and a willingness to learn just might save our very lives. Living in a modern world where we so frequently prioritize shiny new trends over proven traditions, where we constantly confuse loud arrogance with quiet confidence and mistake endless, deafening noise for actual wisdom, we desperately need more stories exactly like this one. We need to constantly remember that the meek shall inherit the earth not due to some abstract, magical divine mandate, but simply because they are the exact type of folks who quietly observe, eagerly learn, rapidly adapt, and successfully survive long after the proud and arrogant have frozen to death. If this incredible tale of poetic justice, of hard-earned redemption, and of ancient, timeless wisdom utterly destroying modern arrogance managed to touch something deep inside your heart today, if it successfully reminded you that there is indeed another path available beyond the deafening noise and foolish pride of our current era, then I need you to go ahead and do two quick things for me. First, go ahead and absolutely smash that like button sitting right down below this video, because every single thumbs up directly tells the YouTube algorithm that incredible stories like this one, tales bursting with genuine humility and authentic wisdom, truly deserve to be pushed out and shared with the rest of the world. Secondly, make sure you share this video with somebody who desperately needs to hear this exact message. Send it over to that tough relative who deeply values backbreaking hard work. Shoot it over to that old friend who holds a profound respect for their elders, or share it with that one specific person who already knows deep down in their soul that true, lasting wealth isn't found in shiny bars of gold, but rather in possessing the quiet wisdom of knowing exactly how to survive, how to fiercely protect your own family, and how to construct something that will outlast your own foolish pride. We are operating right here on the front lines, actively rescuing these forgotten, buried stories from the dustbin of history, pulling them out one by one, simply because we firmly believe that our distant past holds highly critical lessons that our impending future desperately needs to hear. Make sure you are completely subscribed to this channel if you want to catch more incredible tales featuring highly ordinary men and women who pulled off absolutely extraordinary feats, not through some flashy magic or blind dumb luck, but through relentless hard work, quiet observation, and possessing the profound humility required to actually learn. I will catch you guys in the very next story, where we are going to continue actively unearthing the profound historical truths that time desperately tried to bury and forget. Until we meet again, always remember this: Mother Earth takes excellent care of the folks who show her genuine respect, and the quiet, proven wisdom of the ancients is worth vastly more than all the shiny gold sitting in the modern world.